I'm more than happy to sort of launch into some thoughts and reactions, and perhaps start with a caveat. I am not from this sector. I have limited experience and credibility, so I am in awe of the experience and expertise in the room. So please take all my observations and snarky remarks in that light. Nevertheless, I've been encouraged to dare to air them. So I'll have a go and, shoot me down. Thought experiment. Imagine a different parallel universe. You're in charge of a camp that's been set up. To your point about prioritization, which is very well made, you need to prioritize. You decide, so you have to think about what your facilities you're going to build. Imagine you decide that given the limited resources, you're only going to build women's toilets, women's latrines in the camp. It'll do for 50% of the population, roughly, and we'll just go with that. Of course, this is never going to happen, right? But that is actually in a very good parallel for what we end up doing in the space that we're in, which is as we prioritize, we exclude and we marginalize people. And we consistently, in making those priorities in terms of information, communication, and the access we provide, the listening that we do, we consistently marginalize the most vulnerable. The people who are otherwise marginalized get further marginalized by the prioritizations that we make. So I think we need to be extremely conscious of that and careful about that as we think about how we reach people, how we engage with people in conversations, how we listen to them, that marginalization is happening every time we make a priority decision. And we sometimes see that those priorities are needed, of course, but sometimes are made in the sort of fastest, most convenient route rather than the most impactful route. So as I said, I'm massively in awe of the room and what I've heard. I would agree with almost everything I've heard. I'm struck by the level of agreement in the room, which I think I'll come back to in a minute. I think is actually more of an issue than an asset. I would, if I may, take issue with one thing that Richard said, which was on two-way conversations, just to start an argument for the sake of it. I think a point well made that often the conversations that we have are not good conversations. We talk about two-way conversations. I would argue our aspiration should remain to be in conversation with as many people as we can. We have a slogan, 4 billion conversations to reach the other half of the world's population. But like any conversation, we need to be a responsible partner in that conversation. And that, I think, is the problem that you're highlighting, which is that too often we are a domineering, uninterested, unempathetic partner in those conversations. We just turn up and say, we've got something to say, I'm going to say it, and I'm going to go away. Not quite, but that is often the perception of it. So I think we're a big believer at Clear in the need for conversations and the need to establish channels of communication. I can't believe that I've spoken this long without saying the L word. Language is the key to doing this well, is a fundamental belief of behind why we are where we are, why we do what we do. We've heard a lot about listening and the power of listening, and the impact of listening is, we've heard from several different speakers that we learn stuff when we listen. No big surprise, but it's a constant. What's really interesting is the things we didn't expect to hear when we listened. Listening is often treated as a routine thing. Of course, we'll hear about the things, about when food's being delivered well and whether the issues are being fixed or not. What's really interesting about listening is that it starts to give the people you're serving the opportunity to influence what you're doing. And that is a wonderful thing. It's also a really scary thing. And I have been in situations where we have opened up channels to communication, which have subsequently been closed by those in authority because they were opening up feedback that didn't fit the world model. So those things happen, and I think part of our responsibility is to set up those to be radical and forthright in demanding that those two-way channels, sorry, Richard, stay open, and are fundamental to any channel of communication is that it is a two-way channel of communication where we can spend a lot of time listening and respond, be able to respond to that listening. And I spend a lot of time talking to donors. They say to me a lot that they are very interested in how we can, as a sector, can be better at listening. So I think that's something that we can probably take upstairs in our matrix organizations and say, as a justification for why this is important. We've heard a lot of things about reaching people, engaging people, and I think that language is a fundamental part of that. It's a fundamental part of showing empathy, showing that you care. And we've seen the way people's faces light up when they see that they are being offered a conversation in their own language, especially digital experiences. No one expects digital experiences in anything other than former colonial languages. And as soon as you go beyond that into the languages of the people that you're trying to reach, their own languages, they immediately engage at a level you can't get otherwise. And they will immediately, not blindly, but they will their level of trust will go further, will rise. Their level of empathy, their feeling that you empathize and take them seriously will rise. And I can't emphasize enough how powerful that simple trick can be, is to engage people in their own language. I'm not going to use the famous Madiba quote, but the reaching people in their own language is an extremely powerful way to move that step closer to them and get there. The reason I think we've talked, I understand there was a conversation about racism yesterday that I missed, but I apologize for that. But I do think that's something that we should be taking head on, because fundamentally underlying some of this is not necessarily a racist attitude, but it is a global north attitude that somehow we can't afford to prioritize all this strange cultural stuff that the people we're serving have. We're just trying to get something done, and the cultural and local and linguistic considerations they have to take second priority to that. And I think fundamental in the transition or the shift that everyone's talking about here today, and we all seem to have consensus on, is I think that shift towards, if we mean a shift towards local language, is going to be a huge part of that, taking it seriously. And to your point, thinking about how to scale that as a process. How can we do this in a way that doesn't involve us having to have handle 7,000 languages in every program that we run? The issue of scale, I'll come back to that later, is a really important one. Some other observations is I loved this our walk through the various areas, climate change and education and sexual reproductive health, etc. From my perspective, as an outsider, largely as a technologist, I am struck more by the similarities across all of the areas than I am about the differences. And that what we hear a lot is 3 H's. This is huge. The need for what we do is massive, is inconceivably large. The second thing is it's horizontal, and that's a challenge. It sounds great, but it's actually a real challenge, because if you're thinking about how do you address all of these problems and get what used to be called best practice across all of these sectors. That's a huge challenge in itself. How do you learn from one area of activity to another these kinds of common challenges, and how to solve them, and how to what works well in those contexts? And the third H is, we've heard a couple of times, is this is really hard. I think lots of people nodding at the idea of we need to engage people and we need to engage them in their own language. That would be great if we could do that, but this is really hard, especially if you take seriously all of the channels that you want to add to, not just traditional channels, but if you want to mix them together, if you want to combine radio with digital channels of communication, this gets hard. And I think an area of expertise that hasn't yet got widespread sort of acceptance. Often the hardness of it means that people make compromises and make priority choices and think, okay, let's not do that. Let's do some old stuff that's simple because that's what we know how to do and we have to move on. And I think that is increasingly an opportunity lost, an opportunity to win trust and do the job well. One last observation, and then I'll move into some of the stuff that we're doing. I think we've heard a lot of people talking about people, which is great. I always hesitate when I hear the word communities in these kinds of conversations, because particularly from a language perspective, but actually from any perspective, and we've talked about youth as one of the factors in that, I am extremely suspicious of us developing strategies around communicating with communities, because they are so diverse. Every community we look at, communities don't speak one language. In almost every context we've been involved in, the community doesn't speak one language. They speak several languages. They will mix them up, which is always a challenge in itself, especially for language technology. But also we will see serious fissures in that community by various demographics. Gender is a huge one in terms of language, in terms of access to information and the ability to listen. Gender is a huge one, age is a huge one, level of education is a huge one. All of these factors mean that you can't look at a community and say, how do we reach that community? You have to think of people and a bit more nuance in that, in developing those ideas. Okay, I'll come back to that in a minute. Part of this, one last thing perhaps that we are struggling with, I think the sector struggles with, is this idea around the approach of reaching people locally and engaging with local communities. The traditional process has been to engage local staff in that, just to say, we'll go this far, and then we have local staff that does that piece, that last piece, where we handle all the languages and things. And I think we need to put a stake in the ground and say that doesn't work. That strategy is fundamentally flawed for a whole bunch of reasons. But one particular reason, I'll give you an example of we built in the very early days of COVID, we built a chatbot, conversational AI agent that could talk on WhatsApp about COVID in DRC, in the Eastern DRC. And one of the ideas was to address, actually largely to support the international community as it was responding and as volunteers were responding, also local volunteers were responding. And one of the things we found out, because we were listening, we found out that we hadn't expected, was that the local staff were consulting the chatbot to discover how to talk about the issues around COVID in their own language. They had been trained in French, because that's the colonial language, by the international staff. And then they said, okay, you speak Congolese, Swahili, and Lingala. Go out and communicate this message that we've told you in French to your communities. And of course, they couldn't do that. How could they? They hadn't been equipped to do it. So fundamentally, this is part of sort of that advocacy that we need to have in order to think about how to do this in a way that's going to work. I'm a technologist. I will say that up front. But I think the technology needs to be regarded as potentially an answer to something. It is not the answer to anything. My career has been focused on applications of technology largely, and I think I just want to highlight a few areas where I think the language technology is a huge enabler, is a huge opportunity for us to augment the approaches that we do. Lots of people assume that AI will come in and replace things that are currently happening. I don't think that will happen. But even if you wanted it to happen, I think it would be a terrible idea. Most of the approaches that work, most of the approaches that we as a sector are using, actually work really well. So training local staff and sending them out and having them communicate with their communities is a really effective strategy, particularly in areas around climate change and others. The issue with it really is that it doesn't scale very well. And so what we consistently hear from our partners in programs is we'd like to do more of this, but it can only go so far. And to your point, priorities, resources are limited. How can we go further? And the technology can play a role in giving you, as a program person, extra reach, the ability to reach more people more reliably. Potentially, there are channels that are not possible, and certainly the safe spaces for young girls and women to talk about sexual and reproductive health without having to go to a family doctor or a family member is a huge new opportunity that doesn't exist in any other way. But generally, the opportunities, I think, are augmentations of existing approaches and should run alongside them. And we've done some really interesting work. We have a phone-in, radio phone-in in Nigeria, northeast Nigeria, which runs alongside a chatbot, and they interact with each other in interesting ways. So there are three key areas around language AI that I think are important. The first one is voice, which is voice technology, which breaks down the literacy barrier, allows you to speak to a device and have the device understand you and speak back to you. The speaking back to you piece is what we call conversational AI. Again, Richard, sorry, take this conversation thing seriously. Most chatbots that you'll see out there, you may have seen them. Most people hate them for the very simple reason that they're not conversational, that they're not well-designed experiences. They have no ambition to listen. And I think we have seen some very good ones. We'd like more of that. Conversational AI is a huge enabler. And finally, machine translation, which is the hardest thing to do for any language, but which is really the holy grail, where we open up the same kind of access to information that the rest of us have to a broader community. So I think that's pretty much all I had. I would like to pick up the comments we've heard from several people around the need for systemic approaches to this, the need to build systems and think about scale. As this is hard, there's no point in doing it just once really well. The only way we can do this properly in a way that is interesting is if we can build a machine to allow us to do this at a global scale across all of the sectors and for all the people that we're trying to reach.